Now, I would stand on stage, but when I did this presentation at Quirks, Chicago, I had a broken foot, so I couldn't. It was too dangerous. But I do walk around a lot. Like I like to Phil Donahue this stuff. And I'm afraid I'd walk off the stage and go home with another broken foot. That's not what we're looking for. Welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm sorry if my voice is a little gravelly. Last night, my friend Amy and I went to go see Billy Joel at the Garden. Anyone else go see Billy Joel? No one? Oh my God. What's that?
Not last night.
But you've seen him before. Well, I thought that I could sing his songs better than he could, apparently. So that's the reason. I don't know. I may be right. I may be crazy. I'm not sure. It definitely put me in a New York state of mind. That's for sure. And I'll cut out the Billy Joel puns right about now. Welcome. My name is Mike Carlon. I host a podcast called Uncorking a Story. I'm also a qualitative moderator, so I actually do make a living asking people questions in all sorts of environments. But that's not really what I'm here today to talk about, although I have done it since 1996. I myself have been author of 8 novels, started writing books a little over 10 years ago, and as part of that, I launched a podcast. I launched a podcast really for 2 reasons. Number one, the original reason was to showcase my interviewing skills. Because if anyone here works in qualitative, you might have come across a scenario before where somebody asks you, hey, I'd like to hire you, but I need to see a tape of your work. They want to hear or see you interviewing. And that's really not something we can do. I can't send, my American Express client or prospective client work I've done for Pepsi. It's just not cool. So I started this podcast really as a way of showcasing my interviewing skills. And I found interesting people to talk to, and I sent people to the podcast to listen. And it all worked out great. But then as I started writing books, I'm jumping ahead of myself here. As I started writing books, I hired a publicist to help me sell more books. And he said, hey, you've got this podcast that doesn't really have much of a focus. Why don't you interview some of our authors? So he had other clients. And I said, that sounds like a really good idea. So the first real big name author I got to interview was a woman by the name of Tess Garretson. Is anyone familiar with Tess Garretson's work? Has anyone heard of the TV show Rizzoli and Isles?
Oh, yeah.
A few more people would have heard of that. So Tess wrote the book series that TV show was made on. I think it's 21 or 22 novels right now. And she's, sold 40 million books. So here I am, an author, trying to, become a better writer. And I've got this 40+ million bookseller on the other end of my screen. I'm like, how cool is this? So the podcast actually then became a way for me to really learn from the best of the best. And I got to interview, as I was interviewing more people like Tess, you can take the researcher out of research, but not research out of the researcher or something like that. I don't know, I just kind of made that one up. But my instincts kicked in, and I'm like, God, I'm learning so much from these people. I should start documenting some of my learnings. And that's where the sort of nerdy researcher instincts kicked in. And one of the insights that I walked away with was that publishing a book, and Rob Volpe's going to really nod at this one, but publishing a book is a lot like launching a product, right? We like to think, if you're not a writer, you like to think that authors kind of go off in their hole somewhere and they write and they write and they write, and then all of a sudden, magically, somehow a book gets published. There is a long process that goes behind that. And I was thinking, as I'm talking to all these authors, one of the questions I always ask them is, what are some of the things that surprise you most about the publishing process? And they tell me that they never really understood the business behind it. But I want to bring this to life a little bit. This is my fun build slide. But authors and marketers have to ask similar questions along the way as they're building whatever it is they're building. So let's talk about authors first. What authors have to do before they start writing something, right? They've got the blank page in front of them, the blank screen. They need to ask, what do people need, and how can we make something people want? So, if you're an author, if you're writing fiction, even if you're writing nonfiction, you want to find some kind of white space opportunity that's going to sell. So there you're thinking about your genre, you're thinking about your story. Marketers have the same problem. Right, Amy, I know, has worked in product development for a very long time. as marketers, we have to identify white space opportunities. Where are there places we can innovate? Where can we make a line extension? Where can we have a new product? So that's all by asking that same question that authors and marketers have to ask. What do people need? How can we make something people want? And then how do we begin the process? Now, if you're an author, you start with an outline, leads to a manuscript. And that is your product, that is your prototype. But, of course, marketers have to find ways to inform concepts and inform prototypes. And they're going to create a prototype that they can then bring to the market and test somehow, whether that's in qualitative or quantitative research. But they're asking the same question, how do we begin the process? And then we have to know, well, how do we know if it's any good, right? So authors, what you may not know, but what a lot of authors do, is we hire content editors. We don't hire beta readers, we find beta readers to read our work. And we just want to get a sense of, is it any good, right? The content edit is very, very important. A lot of people think editor, they think, okay, they're going to fix my grammar, or they're going to fix my spelling. Now, the most important edit you can really do is to have some kind of objective third party come in, from an editor's point of view, and actually do a real solid content edit. You have to make certain your story makes sense, that your voice is consistent throughout the whole thing, right? So that's what content editors do. Beta readers also, you develop fans as you write. You send them early copies of your work, and they give you some feedback. And of course, we're all here at a market research event, right? So on the marketing side of things, we do market research. We do qualitative research, we do quantitative research. And the goal there is to understand, hey, does this idea have legs? Is this something that is worth pursuing? And then we got to get the green light somehow, right? I know I'm really simplifying this process, and Amy's probably laughing because she's about to initiate a stage gate process at Swisher. But then you eventually have to get the green light. Now, for authors, that means getting a book deal, and there's a lot that goes behind that. If you're not independently publishing, getting a book deal means finding an agent, finding someone who can represent you with publishers, and getting them to believe in you. And then once you do that, you're going to go through another round of edits because your publisher is going to have an editor who's going to want to see a lot of changes. And of course, on the marketing side of things, you're trying to get senior management buy-in, right? You're going through your stage and gate process. You're making sure that the finances make sense. And all that good stuff. You're aligning your supply chains, you're talking to retailers, all that fun stuff. And at the end of the day, you want to know how you can earn the attention of browsers and create shelf pop. For authors, that is pretty much cover design. You want to make sure you have a great cover. Rob's book has a wonderful cover if you haven't seen it yet. They did a very nice job on that. And for marketers, of course, it's package design. You want to make sure your package, your product is going to pop on shelf, whether that's on a digital shelf or traditional shelf. There's a lot of work that goes around doing that. Ooh, can we bump up that volume a little bit? I don't think that we had the payoff there. That's much better. One more time? Okay, now I'm happy. And then once you have it, like once your book is in distribution, once your product's in distribution, of course, you've got to do advertising and promotion. When I ask authors on the show, what's the one thing that surprises them most? It's how hard it is to do the advertising and promotion. Because even if you have a publisher, even if you have a really big publisher, they're going to make you do the most of that work, right? You're going to be appearing on shows like mine and probably 15, 20, 30 shows like mine to get your word out. You're also going to have to do a lot of other forms of PR as well, book signings, that kind of stuff. It is surprising for authors because they say, I used to think that writing was the hard part. And now they say, no, writing's not the hard part. Writing's the fun part. The hard part is doing all this shit. So that's that. However, that's not the only kind of pattern I found when talking with authors. I also found 5 traits that market researchers and marketers share in common with authors. I'm going to talk about each of these, and I'm going to use some clips from the show, if that's okay. The first thing I want to talk about is curiosity. Has anyone here read the Made by Nita prose? It is separate from the show that is on Netflix right now. It was one of the #1 anticipated launches this past January. I had the opportunity to interview her. But what I think was so cool about her story, I asked her, hey, well, how did this story come to you? Because that's what I'm really curious about. how do people get the ideas that they write about and turn into like New York Times bestsellers? Well, she had a very, very ordinary encounter with a hotel roommate. True story, she's about to tell it. But I just want you to think about the power of curiosity that we actually all have. And as marketers and market researchers, we can tie into it as well. But I'm going to let Nita tell her story right now.
I was staying in a London area hotel, and I stepped out for a bit for a meeting and came back at an unusual hour in the morning, opened my hotel room door, and completely startled the maid who was cleaning it. And I remember her, jumping backwards into a dark corner. And, the highly embarrassing part is that she had my pants in her hand because I'd gone for a run that morning, left my sweatpants in a tangled mess on my bed like an idiot. And she was holding those and looking shocked to see me. And I just thought to myself, wow, it's such an intimate and invisible job to be a roommate. She'd been cleaning my room for days, so she knew so much about me that I knew nothing about her. So that's how it started. And it was just like one of those funny little things that lodges in some unconscious part of your brain. And then you get on with your day.
Yeah.
And then, a few days later, I was on my plane ride home after my trip, and that's when it started to really gel for me. I started to hear Molly's voice, the protagonist from the maid, and it was crisp. It was clean and precise, and it was polished to perfection, and I heard it. I heard it just like that. And I grabbed the napkin from under my drink because I didn't have any paper, and I started to write what is now the prologue to the book in a single burst. And that is when, even though I didn't know it at the time, I started my debut novel.
Wow. I love that story. I really, really love that story. And, because you hear about business deals being made over cocktail napkins and stuff. She started writing a book that became a New York Times bestseller on a cocktail napkin, but her superpower is curiosity. It's curiosity, and as researchers, that's a must-have trait for us as well. I love Columbo. I'm not going to lie. If you heard me use a shadow reference before, Columbo is my absolute favorite. If you're in an episode of Columbo, right, and he asks you more than 3 questions in a row, you are done for, you're gone, you just put the handcuffs on yourself, you're going to prison. But some of the most compelling insights I've ever had was when I go off script. I don't even look at my moderator's guide. I just follow my nose, and I go into interesting places. And I think we could all learn from that, right? We could all learn to follow our noses rather than our discussion guides. So let's give it up for Columbo. Or not, we don't have to, that's lame. Encouragement, let's talk about encouragement. So we talked about curiosity, we're gonna move on to encouragement. Just about every author I talk to tells me, because I always ask them, where does your story begin? That is my opening question. I actually don't have any questions written out for the people I interview on the show, except for, tell me, where does your story as an author begin? And most of the time, they start by telling me, I had a teacher in 5th grade or 4th grade, name a grade, who saw something in me, who encouraged me. Or sometimes, as what you're going to hear from Aileen Weintraub, it was her school librarian.
There was this librarian, and she was absolutely beautiful in my eyes. She had long black hair. It was the 70s or early 80s, those A-line dresses, super tall, big, round black glasses, and I can picture her so vividly, but I can't for the life of me remember her name. And this has been haunting me for a long time because I'm like, well, she had such a big impact on my career at such a young age, and I just can't remember who she is, what her name is. And she taught me a love of reading, and she loved Madeline, which was also my favorite book. And she would guide me through the stacks, and we would pick out books together, and she really cultivated that love of reading.
Yeah, so we all need some encouragement. By the way, I named this episode Life is the Curveball because she had this awesome quote. She says, life doesn't throw you curveballs, life is the curveball. I thought that was so profound, and it gave me chills when she said that, so I named the episode after that. But as researchers, we also need encouragement too. We all work in an industry where mentors are required, but they're not really available. Like when I was coming up, I had a few mentors. These are 3 of my mentors, right? Suzanne Hankey, fantastic moderator, Viewpoints Consulting. Over there on the left, Paul Jacobson was with Greenfield Consulting. In the middle, I used to hire him all the time when I worked at Unilever and MasterCard. Liz was my first boss. She took me to my first ever focus group. That was awesome. It was a life-changing experience. It was Clint Clifford from Greenfield Consulting. The project was Citibank. We were redesigning their homepage. Back in 1997, it was like the second-generation website. But these are three people who really changed my life, and they encouraged me, they encouraged my love of research and getting into the qualitative business. So just like authors need encouragement, we as researchers need encouragement too. So let's talk about vulnerability. The big V word here, the big V word. Any Brene Brown fans here? Right, she talks about vulnerability quite a bit. J.M. Thompson is an author. He wrote a book, and he's a therapist also, but he wrote a book called Running is a Kind of Dreaming. He talks about being suicidal and almost taking his own life. And it was a very heavy conversation. But when you're writing, especially when you're writing memoir, you have to be vulnerable, because if you're not vulnerable, you're not going to come across as being authentic. And even when you're writing fiction, because I primarily write fiction, when I'm not writing great reports for Amy, you have to make yourself vulnerable, because you are leaving a piece of your soul in every character you write. Even if you don't know it, it's a very subconscious thing. You are leaving a piece of your soul in every character you write and in every story that you tell. But with vulnerability comes criticism. You've got to be prepared for it. I do want to talk about, or have you hear what James Thompson has to say about vulnerability.
So what remains really taboo was part of the motivation for the book, is to address head-on the experience of what it's like to be suicidal. What we have not yet really done, my observation is, in a kind of thoroughgoing way, is to create the conditions under which those of us who have reckoned with suicidality feel that it's really possible to talk about that in an open and direct way. It remains still cloaked with silence, shame, and stigma. How things change is by people being willing to come forward and be vulnerable with what they've been through, and that was, of course, part of the motivation here.
I mean, he told a very personal story about almost killing himself and dealing with suicidality. His book is actually really interesting. He turned to running. I know Tina's a runner. Not anymore. Sorry. Used to be a runner. Mitch, you're a runner. Running is kind of dreaming. He turned to running to really help kind of turn his life around. It's a really fascinating read. Not that I'm here to shill anyone's books, but it was actually a very powerful one. But on the research side of things, especially on qualitative, we have to go into rooms all the time and run conversations with complete strangers, and sometimes we have to do that on topics that are very, very sensitive. One time I had to go in to a group and talk about male prostate health with guys who have male prostate issues, and that is not a topic that usually comes up at the dinner table. It's especially in a group of strangers, you have to make people feel comfortable being vulnerable in those situations, and that's kind of like, I think, a researcher's superpower too, is if you can go into a room and make people feel comfortable talking about these very private parts of their lives in front of other strangers, you're doing your job well. But you also have to realize it's not just the participants who are being vulnerable in research, it's also your creative partners, right? Because oftentimes we're taking in advertisements or concepts that we didn't create. Somebody in the back room who's watching created these things. They have to be completely vulnerable because their work is being graded in front of their bosses, in front of their clients. So as researchers, we have to be sensitive to the vulnerability that's required of our creative partners and our marketers as well. All right, empathy, the big one. And I know Rob really cares about empathy. He wrote a book about empathy. In order for an author to really do their job well, you've got to create empathy for your characters. I assume people know who this character is here. I want to shout out who this is. George C. Scott, as Ebenezer Scrooge. It's brought to you by IBM in 1986 or something like that. But do you guys mind if I use foul language for a second? Like, when we meet Scrooge, he is a complete dick, right? He is a dick. He is not a good guy. He does not want to give money to the poor. He shuns his uncle, his nephew rather. He's a complete jerk. But by the end of the story, what happens? We're celebrating with him on Christmas morning, right? Dickens was a master of character development. He was a master of helping us feel something for Ebenezer Scrooge. He does that by showing us, past, present, and what is yet to come. So he and all authors have to do this. We've got to build empathy for our characters in the minds and hearts of our readers. I would also argue that we have to do that as researchers. So I'm going to tell you two stories. There's no video clip here. I'm going to tell you two stories about Mary and James from the south side of Chicago. I was hired, this is probably, about 10 or so years ago. A big insurance company here based in Connecticut was going to have to start selling insurance on the individual market. They've never had to do that before. So now with healthcare reform, they had to sell individual health insurance. They did not know a thing about selling individual health insurance, nor did they know anything about the uninsured. So they hired me to do a research study with uninsured people. These are two people who are uninsured. Mary tells me a story about how she walked into her sister's house and found her dead on the couch. She had been suffering silently from breast cancer, didn't have insurance, couldn't afford treatment, didn't want to be a burden on her family. James was a former gangbanger. He's showing me here where he was shot a few times in the torso. And he looked me in the eye and said, Mike, if I have to make the choice between putting food on the table for my kids, single dad, 2 kids, and paying health insurance, I'm going to choose my kids every day of the week. Every day of the week. And these are powerful stories that I was hearing time and time again from uninsured Americans. So I go back to my client, and I say, you hired me to learn how to help you speak to these people better. But what I want to do is help you understand them better. Because this isn't right. It's not right. So we have to help our clients build a sense of empathy for the people they're marketing to, not just understand them better. We need them to feel these people's lives. Okay, one more. All right, so Debbie Applegate, she has a great book out. It's called Madam. It's about the life of Polly Adler. Anyone know who Polly Adler is or was? Okay, Polly Adler was a madam during the Jazz Age in Manhattan. Debbie wrote a biography about her. Debbie's first biography won a Pulitzer Prize, which was awesome, on Henry Ward Beecher. Interestingly, Debbie's going to tell you a story about how that Pulitzer Prize came to be, and I think it's kind of interesting.
It got started on the first book. I wrote about, I think, 2.5, 3 chapters, and it was becoming increasingly clear to me, and it was abundantly clear to the editor when I turned those first 3 chapters in, that I had no idea what I was doing. I knew how to write a great dissertation, I knew how to do great research, I had no idea how to write a book. And that was that. She canceled my contract right then, pretty much right then and there. I mean, it was really, it was really quite a shock. So I probably would have been discouraged enough to just throw up my hands and go back into academia. But I had been paid in advance, a reasonably good advance, and I had to pay it back. So that meant reselling the book. My goal was to get the reader to read the next sentence, the next paragraph, to turn the page, and God willing, to get to the end of the chapter and to the end of the book. And if that's the case, because that's all that reading really is about, so what is it that makes you read the next sentence? It is wondering what's going to happen next, or what's going to be said next, or wondering why that thing that you just described happened. So I thought, well, okay, that means that's suspense, essentially. How do you create a feeling of suspense that gets people to keep going? So I went to the library and looked up books about how to write thrillers and how to write mysteries, which I knew nothing about. I even read one great essay about how to write pornography, because I mean, who succeeds better in putting ideas in your head than pornographers, and moving the reader to action than a pornographer. And so I just started, I rewrote the proposal, I rewrote the opening chapters using exactly these exercises.
So she got canceled, right? Her publication contract got canceled, and instead of throwing in the towel, she's like, well, I guess I better learn how to write a book. That book won a Pulitzer Prize. Like, what she turned in won a Pulitzer Prize. I think that's an amazing story, but there's a lesson here for us as well, which is uncork a good story. Never submit your first draft to your client, that is for sure. But also learn how to tell a story. Learn how to tell a story to keep your audience engaged. I hope I kept you engaged this afternoon, right before happy hour, in the coveted 4 p.m. speaking slot on Thursday, in the room that is far away from all the other exhibits. Entertain any questions you have. You can certainly scan that code, and you can find every which way to reach me under the sun. So, does anyone have any questions? Oh, go ahead.
Do you read the people's books before you interview them?
I wish I could say yes to all of it, to all their books. I don't. I can't. Sometimes I have, 5 or 6 of these that I do a week. But I like to say that the interviews that I do are not really about the books. They're all about the authors. Like, I really want to get into the author, their background, what motivates them to write. I have some fun questions I ask them. We do talk about the books, but a lot of times they can't say much about their books anyway, because they don't want to ruin a big twist or something. But I think there are some that I do read, because they're actually all. I've read all the ones that we talked about here. Debbie's book is fantastic. 5-Minute Warning. Go ahead, Amy.
How are you picking your topics for your books? Are you doing any research with your audience?
The books that I write?
Yeah, the books that you write, and actually I would love to know about the people you're interviewing. Are you talking to your podcast listeners about who they want to hear from next?
No.
Okay.
So the way the podcast works is I have relationships with publishers. I have relationships with publicists. They pitch me their authors, their clients. Then I cherry pick who it is I want to interview. In terms of my writing process, that is sole and solitary, and I have ideas that come to me that I'll outline. I'll work on outlines for a while, well before I start writing. Only when I think something's ready will I then send it to a beta reader, but that's really far down the process. Good.
So you've got sort of podcast and writing and the qualitative research. How have you seen, if at all, your qualitative research reporting and client delivery change as you've kind of gotten into this, or has it changed? Are they really more separate?
It has changed a little bit. I became a much better video and audio editor as a result of doing this, because I do video and audio clips to help promote each episode, and I will do that for clients as well. Amy's not happy when I put price tags in front of her for that. She likes to give me help for it. But no, so I have become a better editor. I have become a better storyteller as well. Just as Debbie was talking about, kind of learning how to tell a better story, I think I've done that kind of as a byproduct of doing this kind of work. Oh, got a couple more. Tina, go ahead.
So when's your next stand-up act?
Oh,
Did you
yes.
talk about that?
I did not talk about stand-up. To be determined. To be determined. There's a date on the calendar. Well, there's a tentative date at the end of August. Thank you, though. Go ahead.
Much of our work as researchers is storytelling, and I was wondering, have you thought about turning this into a book?
I have thought about turning this into a book. That's actually the next thing I'm writing. It's uncorking a story, and it's almost uncorking my story. It's still in the very early stages of being outlined, but yeah, that is kind of next up. I'm going to take a break from fiction for a bit.
Sure.
But thank you. And actually, somebody at the Quirks conference in Chicago asked me to put together a whole storytelling workshop for an industry association, so we could be parlaying that into workshops as well, which is really cool. Yeah, go ahead.
Having that much experience in qualitative research, I want to know your opinion on what you think is next for that industry, for qualitative research.
Wow. What's next for qualitative? I honestly believe in-person is going to make a huge comeback. And I hope it does, because it's the best way to do research. And what I've been hearing today, even when we were talking, I don't know if anyone went to Market Vision's presentation about Next Gen, the speakers were talking about ways in which the Next Gen prefers to be interviewed, and in-person focus groups were mentioned. And I think there's one thing we learned during the pandemic was how much focus groups are very maligned methodology, and traditional qualitative is much maligned. But I think one thing we learned, being not able to do it for a couple years, is how much we really miss it, and how powerful it is, and how powerful being in a room and being with other people is. So I'd have to say, it's kind of an old school answer, but I think it's the comeback of in-person. Yeah,
What's your feeling about focus groups that are virtual on a Zoom like
hate them. And I've done them for 15 years. I mean, I've done them since like the Adobe Connect days. The problem is people don't pay attention. If I'm running a group of 6 people, the only way I'll do them is if it's like 3 people tops. But if I'm running a group of 6 or 8 people and you're not being called on to talk, you have 2 of the browser windows open, you've got your phone, you've got something going on in the background. Sometimes I have people join virtual sessions from their car and they're driving, which is not safe, and I don't condone. So no, I think I don't think we're there yet for one-on-one interviews. I have no criticisms over. Groups, group dynamics are too difficult to manage. I know we have like maybe 30 seconds before your cocktails begin.
Quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the podcast thing, I've never actually met somebody who does podcasts. What's been your experience with that? Like, what's the frequency you think is the right thing?
So traditionally I do 2 episodes a week. I've had about 60 episodes in the queue because it got very popular this year. I started this in 2012. I'm up to 165 episodes now. The majority of those came in the last 24 months. So in the month of July, I've been releasing an episode every day, Monday through Friday. And then I'm going to be going back to 2 episodes a week. But for someone like me, 2 episodes a week is probably the right pace. Maybe someone even tried to convince me to do just 1 a week. The problem is, I get so many authors who want to come on that if I do 1 a week, then somebody might be waiting until December, for their interview that got, recorded in October. And that's not fair if they're trying to promote a book. So. Anything else before cocktails? Oh, stop! Sorry. Well, if anyone wants to get me, scan that code. You have every which way under the sun to get me. Susan's coming to get her tripod. Susan Fader, everybody!